Welcome to the program on tenders by ARIFM, Indian Railway Institute for Financial Management. I'm Sanjeev Shivesh, and I'm going to be with you in this course. This course is designed for new railway officers, young railway officers, and people who are interested in honing their skills on the issue of tenders and contracts. This course has 10 sessions, beginning straight from introduction to tenders, the tendering process, how to plan for tenders, how to invite tenders, evaluating tenders, and then we move on to 3 or 4 case studies. The most common item which is procured in railway scenario is ballast, and we are going to discuss multiple scenarios of ballast procurement. Let's get started. Introduction to tenders. Now, what is a tender? Tender is essentially a device through which government agency makes procurement through a contractor for goods, services, and other things that it needs for execution of public service, for delivery of public service. Now, on one side, there's a government agency or the body, and on the other side, the other party, which is the contractor. And this contractor is essentially responsible for execution of works or supply of goods and services. Now, in any government procurement, there are 3 important goals. The first goal is to procure the right items. And when we say procure right items, it means that procure items as per desired specifications. Second is to achieve best value for money, to get best value for money, which means that if I have 2 items which have equal specifications, then the item which is giving me better rate gives me more value for money. So that is the second goal. And third is to select the contractor who is capable to execute the work. Now, by saying what capable is, we essentially mean that in the tender document, we specify the qualifying criteria for the selection of contractors. If contractors meet those criteria, then we assume that the contractor is capable of executing the work. So 3 things. Now, let me give you an example. Suppose we want to procure a pen, right? A piece of pen. Now, if this piece of pen can have a very specific criteria, for example, the ink flow rate has to be at the rate of, let's say, 1 millimeter per day. We could say that the nib quality has to be 0.5 mm tip. We can also specify that it could be a felt tip or a steel tip or a platinum tip. And we can also say that the pen should hold so many milliliters of ink. So we can keep specifying all the things that we want. We can also specify the kind of finish that we want on the body of the pen. So we can say that we want a steel finish, we want a matte finish, we want a copper finish, we want a shiny finish, we want a plastic finish. So depending on what we are seeking, we start specifying all the things that we want. And that's quite a task. The second is we also specify all the things that we are looking in a contractor. So for example, we could say that this pen shall be supplied directly by the manufacturer and no one else. And the manufacturer shall have a capacity to manufacture 10,000 pens per day. Now, if you look at the supply chain of pen, the pen is supplied by manufacturer through distributors, through dealers, and then to end customer. But when we say that we want to procure directly from manufacturer, then which means that all the elements of link is gone and manufacturer directly supplies to government. Now, if we have specified that as a qualifying criteria, then in a country like India, there could be about 25 such manufacturers. or maybe 50 such manufacturers. So instead of 10,000 people who could quote for our bid, only 25 or 30 people could quote for the bid. Out of those 25 or 30 people, let's say that there are only 5 people who make pen, which is of the specifications that we specified. It means that only 5 people qualify for this bid. Now, if each of them make pen of the same quality, then we are going to select the contractor or the supplier or the manufacturer, which is going to provide us pen for at the cheapest rate. So the government procurement essentially looks at optimizing or essentially looks at these 3 goals, and it really wants to achieve all 3. So the first, as I said, it is about procuring items at the right specifications, as per the specifications. Second, to select contractors who can supply items that who have the right capability to supply such items. And third, we should get the best rate or the best value for the money. Now, I want to introduce to you a most important concept in public finance, which is called the Canons of financial propriety. And this is essentially because all public servant, government servant, are entrusted with taxpayers' money. And in that sense, it is incumbent on them that they consider taxpayers' money, they consider expenditures on taxpayers' money with utmost care. And in that, and for that reason, the government financial rules specify 5 canons of financial propriety, which are essential for all government procurement. So tender is a form of government procurement, and that is why these financial proprieties are worth considering and to be flagged in our minds. The first, every officer is supposed to exercise same vigilance in respect to government expenditure as a person of common prudence would exercise when he's spending his own money. What does this mean? Now, if I'm a government servant and if I've been entrusted to spend, let's say, 10 lakh rupees for procurement of uh, uh, computers now, and I have to buy, let's say, 10 laptops, which is necessary for the working of my office. Now, in that sense, I'm supposed to exercise the same prudence as if a person of common, uh, a person of common prudence would exercise his judgment. So a person of common prudence, when he has to buy 10 laptops and he has a budget of, let's say, 1 lakh rupees per laptop, uh, instead of just looking at the budget, he starts looking at what specification of laptop does he desire. Does the laptop should have 14-inch screen? Should it have 500 GB hard disk? Should it have, what kind of chip should it have? Should be Intel Core i7 or Core i9, or what kind of RAM it should have, what kind of keyboard it should have. And basis all this, then he goes out scouting for all the laptops which is available in the market, and then tries to get the best value for money. So the first canon of financial propriety is that every officer is expected to exercise the same vigilance in respect to public procurement as if a person of common prudence when he would exercise judgments as if he's spending his own money. The second canon of financial propriety is the expenditure at should not be more than what the occasion warrants. Now, what does this mean? I if I have to hold a, a dinner at my home for people who are in equal stature as me, I would give him the reception that a person of such stature warrants. Vis-a-vis, if I have to hold, uh, if I have a prime minister visiting my home, in that case, the kind of expenditure that I would incur in hosting the person of that stature, it would be different from the person, uh, from the expenditure that I would need to incur when I host a person of the stature of my friend. And, and for that reason, when a person of higher stature or authority uh, is is visiting, I might incur expenditure which could be little higher than a person of my equal stature, and that's the essence of the second standard of financial propriety. The third is no authority should exercise power in sanctioning expenditure which is in his own benefit. So, for example, if I sit in a interview, which is not necessarily expenditure, if I sit in an interview and my nephew is attending the interview, I, as a public authority, must withdraw from that interview, right? Or to extrapolate, if I am sitting on a tender where my relative is an applicant in the tender, I should not be exercising power to sanction expenditure in that case. And in that case, it is wise, it is prudent to withdraw from that decision. The fourth canon of financial propriety is about expenditure from public money and it should not be incurred for benefit of a particular person or section of people unless it has been authorized by law, unless it has been authorized by a public policy, right? And what essentially it means, if a uh, expenditure is not authorized by public policy, it has not been sanctioned by public authority, such expenditure should not be incurred, right? So sanction for expenditure is important for incurring expenditure, right? The fifth standard for financial propriety is the amount of allowances granted to meet an expenditure of particular type should be so regulated that allowances are not a source of profit. Now, this is again important. For example, uh, if I have to travel for work in my own car, and if I have to fix the car travel allowance, now I can fix the car travel allowance at 1 rupee per kilometer. I can fix the car travel allowance at 10 rupee per kilometer. I can also fix the car travel allowance at 100 rupees per kilometer. Now, we have to understand that if I fix car travel allowance at 100 rupees per kilometer, is it a source of profit for me? If it's a source of profit, then it violates canons of financial propriety. Now, if I actually travel and if I'm authorized to travel on, on let us say, a Mercedes, which costs 1 crore rupees, and the hiring cost of Mercedes, let's imagine, is 30,000 rupees a day. And if I regularly, I'm allowed to travel Mercedes, then 100 rupees per kilometer, or maybe even 1,000 rupees per kilometer would not be unfair. But if by public authority and because of my position, if I am allowed to travel only in, let's say, SX4 or Maruti Desire, Suzuki Desire, then in that sense, the car which is available at, let's say, 8 lakh rupees, the hiring cost of that car is going to be 10,000 rupees per month. Now, if it is 10,000 rupees per month, the if you add all the fuel costs and everything, chances are that uh, that the car travel allowance at 10 rupees per kilometer would not be unfair, and it would not be source of profit. And that maths is important for public authority to come to decisions. So that's the fifth canon of financial propriety. And most important, every officer is expected to enforce strict economy in while spending money, and ensure that everyone in his office, people who are below him, they also ensure the same. They also follow the canons of financial propriety. So these canons are important. They are the foundations for incurring public expenditure, and tender is a form, it's a vehicle, as we said, through which public expenditure is incurred. Now, what is a standard tender process? It is essentially a formal, structured, fair, and transparent process of selecting a contractor for supply of items, for execution of works and services, or both. Now, this is the most common method of public procurement. Now, in public procurement, tender is essentially a document. It is essentially a document which is submitted by an entity. So if I'm a tenderer, then I submit a tender to public authority. So in public procurement, tender is a document submitted by a person or an entity in response to a formal invitation by public authority. So only when the public authority calls for tender, only then I tender, then I put my bid, right? So it's a tender is a document submitted by a person or an entity in response to a formal invitation by public authority to participate in a tender. This participation usually opens up on a fixed date, which is also called the tender submission date or the due date. And when the entity or a person like me, when I submit the tender, then it becomes a tender of that person. Very often, two terms, tender and bids, are used interchangeably. Now, to sum it up, tender is a document which is submitted by a person only when a public authority invites for a tender, right? And this is submitted at a due date in a standard form, process, procedure, and that's we are going to discuss further. Now, the starting point of tender is invitation to tender, and such invitations to tender could be in multiple forms. For example, it's also called tender notice. By some agencies, it would be called invitation to tender. Sometimes people use this term called request for tender, RFT. Some people also use the term called request for proposal. And sometimes people also use the term request for quotation. So RFX, where X could be T, P, Q, etc. These are all forms of invitation to tender. And we're going to discuss the difference between each of these. Now, four terms often get used for invitation to tender. The first is expression of interest. The second is RFT, which is request for tender. Third is RFP, which is request for proposal. And fourth is RFQ, which is request for quotation. Now, each of these terms are different, and I'm going to explain to you the difference between each of the terms. So expression of interest, the expression of interest is usually called for by the public authority when the public authority is interested in knowing more details about the product or service we lack clarity in terms of what exactly could be the solution for the problem that I need to solve. And that's why I call expression of interest. It is also to understand and to survey the market as to who all could be the suppliers or contractors available in the market who could potentially service to me. So it is also called the pre-tender stage. Now, basis expression of interest, I could issue, RFT or RFQ, right? So request for tender is a very standard tendering process. It happens when the buyer is very clear about the scope and specifications of things that he's interested in procuring, right? It's a detailed document. Uh, the difference between RFT and RFQ, which I've written here, RFQ is request for quotation, and quotations are invited for low value items, which are low risk. They are simple items. Typically, in railways, quotations are invited for maximum value of items up to 5 lakh rupees. But most works are of much higher value. There are several works, low value items, frequently used items, which are procured through RFQ mechanism, request for quotation mechanism. But most items are procured through request for tender mechanism or invitation to tender, ITT, and RFT. They could be the same thing. RFP is are called for in situations where the product specification and technical details are not available. Once these are available, once I have solicited RFP and evaluated RFP, then it gravitates either to RFT, which is request for tender stage, or RFQ, which is request for quotation stage, right? So EOI and RFP could essentially be very similar, could mean same things, and they should ideally lead to request for quotation or request for tender. So if you evaluate and very often we are going to come across these four terms. Now, another terminology that I am going to introduce to you is to talk to you about something called the tender document. And tender document is prepared by the buying organization. So, for example, if you work for Southern Railway, then and if you work in the DRM office of Southern Railway, then DRM office of let's say Sikandrabad could be the buying organization. If in the case of South Central Railway. If you work for DLW at Varanasi, then DLW could be the buying organization, and then DLW shall be inviting the tender. Now, a tender document essentially contains details of items to be supplied or work to be executed, right? Specifications and quality standards of the items which have to be supplied or works which have to be performed. It also has standard contractual terms. And in railways, the standard contractual terms are often called GCC, General Conditions of Contract. And then it has, the tender document also has few forms which have to be filled. And those forms are essentially for filling of price bid and for submitting the credentials of the tenderer. So, and these are standard pro formas in which tenderer is expected to fill their details, right? And we're going to talk more about it. Now, a tendering process typically has four stages. There could be a fifth that I've not captured, essentially because it could be beyond the purview of the courts, but it is important. The first stage is a pre-tender stage, which is also called the preparatory stage. So, and which is very important. A lot of work has to go in the pre-tender stage. Then the second stage is once I have prepared the tender document, then inviting the tender, which is tender invitation stage. The third is the tender opening, which is a detailed process. And in the e-tendering world, that process has been simplified, but still it has its sanctity and importance. And the fourth is tender finalization. So, which is where the tender committee sits and debates on all the offers received. And the tender committee, the job of the tender committee is to submit recommendation to tender accepting authority. So that role is very important, and we are going to discuss about each of these stages. I also want to introduce you to the concept of uh, four types of tenders, and these four types of tenders are essential. These four types of tenders are, you know, followed by Indian Railways and even other government authorities. The first is open tender, which is advertised tender and open to all. Second is limited tender, and limited tenders are called from few people who form the part of approved list of contractors or approved list of suppliers. The third is special limited tenders. So in case of urgency or in case of specialized work, we call tenders from only parties who can supply such items or perform such specialized works. And the fourth is single tender. This is called either in the case of urgency or in the case of proprietary items. And the standard practice in all government procurement is to go for open tenders, and only in non-standard conditions, as I explained above, the other forms of tenders can be called for.